So today we're going to have a look at how the Expense Connect module for D365 Finance can process transactions from the expense management system Pleo. And I will be showing you how it can process those transactions both as a project expense journal, but also as a general ledger journal, depending on your requirements in the organization. So back in the Pleo platform, we quite simply just go to the export section. And normally you would just select all of your transactions here and export them. But given this is actually live transactions, then I'm just going to go to my previously exported transactions and do a sub-selection in here. So as you can see, I've already pre-selected some and I'm going to select those for export. This gives me a CSV file, which I can go ahead and save on my local hard drive. This will be the file that we process in Dynamics. So back in D365, I'm going to go to the Project Management and Accounting module, as this is where the Expense Connect add-in sits. And even though it sits in the Project Management and Accounting module, it can still be used even though you don't use the functionality within here. So in the scenario where you might want to process it as a ledger journal, which we'll be doing initially. So I'm going to open up the Project Management and Accounting parameters. And in here, we're going to find a tab called Expense Connect. And in here, we can control the behavior when we process the transactions that we are receiving from Pleo. First of all, we can select which journal the system will apply once it's transferring the transactions into the system. And this can be a project journal or a ledger journal. Then we have a parameter for item sales tax group mapping based on the tax codes received from Pleo. Then if you are reimbursing your employees out of a D365, then you can activate reimbursement mapping. It will identify the method of payment used. So is it an out-of-pocket or was the actual Pleo credit card used? And if it was out-of-pocket, then the offset will become a supplier, allowing you to then reimburse the employee via a payment journal. Then in the scenarios where we want to process a ledger journal, we have to select yes to create a ledger journal here. And then we have added additional dimension functionality. So for example, if you want the employee dimensions from the HR module to be defaulted onto the transactions, then we activate this tick box here, use employee dimensions. Or you can go in and you can use customized dimension mapping based on attributes received from Pleo. Or you can go in and activate the dimension mapping, which is basically a custom dimension mapping based on the attributes received from Pleo. So here you might want to map your cost center tags and project tags to a specific financial dimension. So all of that is possible by activating this. Then we also have some default fallback accounts if you want to use it. That goes for both the main account and the offset account. So the parameters here in the middle, they are only for the ledger journal. And in addition to that, when we are importing a file, then we can set up some formatting parameters here that tells the system what to expect and how to process it. So I'm now going to go to the Project Management and Accounting module again, and under our periodic tab we now find this Expense Connect tab as well, where we can go and we can import that file we just downloaded. And we do that by selecting Browse, then we select our file and we upload that to the system, and then we select OK in order to import it. So the transactions, they should now be in our imported expense transactions, which we will find in the Project Management and Accounting module under Inquiries and Reports. And here we got the Expense Connect tab, where we can access our imported expense transactions. So these are now the transactions from Pleo in Dynamics, ready to be processed, and our file parsing functionality has been able to identify the correct fields and put that into the correct destination in the staging table. So all that really remains to be done right now is just to process it, and then we will have a look at the ledger journal that's created on the back of these transactions. And for that, we just go back to the project module and into the periodic area. And now instead of using the import expense transactions, we will select process expense transactions. And this can obviously be set up into a batch job so that it can run fully automated at a certain frequency. And to this I'm just going to say OK. And that will now run in the background. While that runs, we can look at some of the mapping that the system is applying right now. So under setup, instead of going to the parameter section, in here we have an expense connect area where we can set up a lot of these mappings that are being used by the expense connect product when it now processes these transactions. And given that we had activated the dimension mapping, then I'm just going to open up that. In here you can see how we can essentially select any field from our staging table, and we can remap what we receive in those fields to dimensions. And then when the system processes the transactions, it will construct the correct dimension string against the main account that we're receiving as well. And now let's have a look at the actual journal created. So we're going to go to General Ledger, have a look at our general journals, and in here you can see we now have a journal created. The system also puts in the earliest and the latest date of the transactions that's been processed, just so it's easy to identify what each journal contains. And if we open this up, then we can now see all of our transactions from Pleo in this ledger journal. And the system has constructed the accounting string according to our dimension rules. So in this case, it's actually taking the account that's we are receiving from Pleo. Then these two dimensions are coming from the employee itself, and then it's identifying the correct project dimension, and it's entering a correct description, the values of our expense transactions. Then for the transactions that were identified as being reimbursable, it's using the offset account type as vendor for the as an offset account. Where it's not reimbursable, it's using the ledger type and the offset account, or the main offset account, which we are receiving from Pleo. If we weren't receiving a main offset account from Pleo, then it could use the one from our parameters. And that's really it. So from this point on, it's really over to your standard D365 process. Let's have a look at how all of this looks like if we want to process it as a project expense journal instead. So I'm going to go back to the project management and accounting area. I will re-import that same file. So I'm going to select that, re-import it. Now if we go to our imported expense transactions, which was under inquiries and reports, then in here we can now see that the previous ones we had imported, they are now fully processed. The ones I just imported again, they sit down here, ready to be transferred to a journal. So before we can actually transfer these to an expense journal, we're just going to update the parameters, which will be in here. We're going to go to the Expense Connect tab again, and then we quite simply just going to deselect the create ledger journal, and this will now make the system create a project journal. And the last thing we need to do is just update the journal type. So I'm going to select project journal. Now the transactions will be processed in the project management and accounting module. These transactions, just to process them again, we will select process expense transactions, and I'm going to select OK. Now, instead of going to the general ledger module, we're going to go to the project management and accounting module. And because this is now creating a project expense journal, then the system will apply our project specific mapping, which we have in our expense connect setup area, allowing the system to allocate the correct expense categories, projects, and figure out whether or not it should be billable or not. And all this information is then transferred to the journals. So if I open up an expense journal now, then in here we now find an expense journal, and just as we had on the ledger side, it puts in the earliest and latest transaction date. And if we have a look at the individual transactions inside, then we can now see that the Pleo transactions are created as project expense transactions instead of ledger transactions. And these are now allocated to the correct project. If we wanted to, then the mappings can also identify activity numbers if you're using work breakdown structures. It has identified what category to assign to the individual transactions, which project resource they belong to. Obviously also transferred the cost price from Pleo, and based on that, the standard sales price calculation is applied, so that in case this is a billable expense to your clients, then all of that is ready to go onto an invoice. And we are also able to identify and the system also updates the offset account according to the reimbursable rules. So for reimbursable transactions, again, it's assigning it to the vendor associated with the employee, and for all other transactions it's just a normal ledger offset account. In the case where it's a vendor offset account, there's some additional information needed by the system in order for us to be able to process these expenses. The Expense Connect module is also filling that out. One of those things would be an invoice ID, and here we just use the transaction ID from the expense system as the invoice ID, and then everything else is just defaulted from the actual supplier. And that was a demo of how our Expense Connect module can process the transactions from Pleo. And at the current time of this recording, there's no API available from Pleo, but once that becomes available from Pleo, then we will obviously release the API connector for that shortly after. Hope you found it useful.